Good afternoon. I am pleased to welcome you to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Jennifer Tardelli. I direct our museum's educational programs and resource creation for our military and government audiences. We work closely with our colleagues in the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide and the U.S. Army War College's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute to bring you this afternoon's panel, Protection of Civilians Looking Forward. As a living memorial, the museum holds an honored role in preserving the memory of those who suffered during the Holocaust. We play an important role in advancing the knowledge about the Holocaust, and we encourage individuals and institutions to reflect on the questions and challenges raised by this history. The genocide of the Jewish people during World War II did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in the context of war. Indeed, Hitler's desire for more territory to accommodate his Aryan Empire necessitated war to claim new land. The genocide occurred in the context of numerous mass atrocity crimes. The genocide against the Roma and Sinti, the war crimes resulting in the death of over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, the crimes against humanity targeting political opponents, Slavs, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, mentally and physically disabled, crimes initiated by Nazi Germany but carried out with active or passive involvement by so many collaborators throughout Germany and from other nations. We understand that mass atrocity crimes often occur under the cover of war, a cover that blurs lines and makes civilian casualties more acceptable as collateral damage, a cover that challenges professionals, especially military personnel, to make decisions about human life in unforgiving environments. In our Levine Institute for Holocaust Education, we deconstruct the context that enabled such massive violations to occur. And in our educational programming, we seek to understand what factors influence how professionals act in challenging environments. Our programs explore both the institutional and individual factors that influence behavior, and from the history, we understand that structures matter. The environment in which individuals operate inform action. Thus, we wonder, how do we create better systems that enable the individuals acting within the best chance to make good choices in blurry and intense environments? And the museum cannot do this work alone. Fortunately, incredibly smart and gifted individuals work to actively improve such structures today, and we're fortunate to have 4 such individuals here on the stage to discuss one approach that can influence systems and improve individual action, the Protection of Civilians Manual. So as the educational branch of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, our strength has come from understanding these evolutions and working with such incredible thinkers and movers to ensure an examination of the past continues to inform our present and future. I'm excited to introduce to you first Allison Giffen. Ms. Giffen is the Peacekeeping Program Director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. She previously served as a Senior Advisor for UN Peacekeeping at the Department of State International Organizations Affairs Bureau and was a Senior Associate at the Simpson Center's Future of Peace Operations Program, where she founded the Protecting Civilians in Conflict Project. Allison will share with us a sense of where we have come in the evolution of protection of civilians. We're joined by Major General John Kem, who is the Commandant of the U.S. Army War College. He's an engineer officer with extensive experience including Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Enduring Freedom. He recently served as the first provost of the Army University and deputy commandant of the Commandant General Staff College. General Kem will discuss the manual and why these concepts matter today for military professionals. And Dr. Sarah Sewell, a distinguished scholar at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She served as Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights from 2014 to 2017. And Dr. Sewell will challenge us to think about next steps. How do we advance these norms and not only advance them in the United States context, but in a greater global community? And we would not be here today if it wasn't for the dedicated work of Dwight Raymond of the U.S. Army College's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute. Dwight is the primary author of the Protection of Civilians Military Reference Guide, as well as an author of several military doctrinal publications, including the U.S. Army Manual on the Protection of Civilians. So if you'd please join me in welcoming our 4 guests to the stage today. At this point, I'm going to hand the mic over to Dwight, who will be moderating the panel, and I'll let Dwight take it away.
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank the Holocaust Museum for hosting this event and thank all of the attendees for taking the time to be here, and also the distinguished panelists that I'm privileged to be up here on the stage with. I'm going to be keeping my remarks to a minimum throughout the panel discussion. The main reason I'm here is that if a question does come up about the guide, what it does say, what it doesn't say, I'm here to help out in that regard. So without further ado, I turn to the far right to Alison Giffen, who, not to pin the blame, but in many ways she was the primary inspiration for the first version of the guide a few years back, when she did her work on addressing the doctrinal deficit in the protection of civilians. And in large part because of that work, that kind of provided the spark for developing a protection of civilians reference guide that helped fill in some of the gaps. And she was very instrumental in the development of that version. And the guide, in many respects, reflects a lot of her insights and views. So, Alison.
Thanks so much, Dwight. I want to thank you and the U.S. Army War College Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, and Jen and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for having me here today to speak. It's always a privilege for me to talk about protection of civilians and how to strengthen institutions and encourage actors to take action in the face of atrocities. And it's a particular pleasure to speak here and share the stage with Major General Kem and Dwight and Dr. Sewell. In addition to, and I won't lie, it's a bit intimidating to be looking out on this crowd because I see so many friends and colleagues who really have blazed the trail on these issues, and so I very much expect you to fill in the gaps of what I say during the Q&A. And along those lines, I really do want to recognize Victoria Holt, who's sitting here today. She really laid the groundwork and blazed the path for pushing myself and others to try and fill the doctrinal deficit, as well as Max Kelly, who worked a lot with Dwight and Sarah Sewell and Bill Flavin and others on these issues in the past. So I've been asked to talk about the development of the protection of civilians concept over the last 2 decades. And I'm cognizant of the fact of the building that we're sitting in and the work that this museum has done to really document the atrocities of the past in order to prevent them in the future. I'm cognizant of the fact that we have violence happening and atrocities happening right now in Syria, in Myanmar, in South Sudan, in Central African Republic, and too many other locations. And I do think that these are all continued clear evidence that external actors such as states and international organizations, that the media, the academics, the humanitarians, that other actors of civil society that myself are not prioritizing the protection of civilians and atrocity prevention as we all should. We are not moving fast enough to identify what works. We are not dedicating adequate resources. And too many leaders and decision makers either lack the political to act to stop atrocities or are purposely discouraging efforts to do so. However, as we rightfully take note of these failures and try and learn lessons, I think we also need to acknowledge the incredible progress that has been made over the last 2 decades. Efforts to develop and implement laws that hold states responsible for upholding human rights and laws that hold armed actors responsible for protecting civilians in conflict from their own actions have of course been developing for over 100 years. But the current phase of concerted efforts to go beyond these legal frameworks, to call on external states, civilians, and military actors to protect civilians above and beyond IHL and from the acts of other actors has only really been underway for these last 2 decades. At the end of the last century, numerous actors, including the UN, NATO, the AU, individual states, and humanitarian actors were questioning what they could and should have done differently to protect civilians from some of the most egregious forms of violence against civilians, including genocide that unfolded in the 1990s. There was, of course, the development of the concept of the responsibility to protect. Humanitarian actors developed principles and guidance to protect civilians through humanitarian action, including ways to avoid exacerbating risk to civilians through their own actions, but also to help advocate for other actors to protect civilians when the actions that were required went beyond their mandate. There were also efforts, including by my organization, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, to urge armed actors to identify, mitigate, and make amends for harm they caused civilians during their own operations, even if that harm is allowed under international humanitarian law. And then there is the concept and the issues that I'm going to focus on mostly today, which there was the development of the concept of protecting civilians from violence perpetrated by other actors, particularly through peace support operations. So in the late 1990s, 98, 99 specifically, the UN Security Council passed the first resolutions that were about protecting civilians from violence perpetrated by other actors. There were 3 thematic resolutions. One was on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Another one was on women, peace, and security, which included language on protection of women from gender-based and conflict-related sexual violence. And then there was one on protection of children in the context of armed conflict. That same year, the UN Security Council authorized the peacekeeping operation in Sierra Leone to use force to protect civilians from imminent threat. That was the first time that a peacekeeping operation had been authorized to use force beyond self-defense. I had the privilege of being in Sierra Leone at the end of that conflict in 2001, 2002. I was managing a project that interviewed over 1,000 ex-combatants about their experience and hundreds of civilians. The kinds of atrocities that we were recording, the level of sexual violence that was used in that conflict, children who were forced to rape and kill their family members, their friends, their neighbors, and forced into the armed parties, amputations to prevent people from voting. These were the kinds of threats that peacekeepers had been mandated to protect civilians from. Yet these peacekeepers had been trained at home to take ground, to defeat an enemy in wartime. And then they were told that when they were going into a peacekeeping operation that they were to use defensive actions, static deployments, basically to monitor ceasefires. They were given no guidance. How were they supposed to know how to demobilize and disarm children who had experienced such trauma? Jump forward a few years, and I was in Darfur, monitoring the peacekeeping operations there. It was 2009. You had an AU-UN peace operation that was facing fracturing armed actors that were targeting civilians for various reasons. You had a government that was obstructing visas of UN personnel, of armed personnel carriers from entering the country, that weren't allowing either UN personnel or humanitarians to move between cities. It was a very complicated situation, and yet still you had no real guidance for those peacekeepers on how they were meant to protect. There weren't lessons learned coming in really from other peacekeeping operations, and in fact some of the most effective protection of civilians that was happening in Darfur at that time was due to humanitarians effectively advocating for the peacekeeping operation to do things like firewood patrols to try and secure the perimeter of IDP camps that had 80,000 vulnerable civilians in them, and a few proactive leaders and personnel within that peacekeeping operation. Victoria Holt and others were commissioned by the UN to undertake a review of the first decade of protection of civilians through peacekeeping. And that study, which is like 300 plus pages, outlined a number of these gaps and really confirmed that they were there. One of the big gaps that had been identified by others and were identified in the study was the lack of guidance, the lack of training. People within a peacekeeping operation didn't understand what the concept of protection of civilians from the violence of other actors meant. They didn't know how to train for it. They didn't know what they were expected to do on the ground, what their responsibilities and requirements were. After that study, in part because of that study and other research and advocacy, the African Union developed guidance on the protection of civilians, which was draft. The UN developed guidance, which later became policy in 2015. They then developed not only policy for all of the actors in a peacekeeping operation, which includes civilian, military, and police, but they developed guidance that was specific for militaries. They also developed sort of comprehensive training, which was the big concepts of what protection of civilians means in peacekeeping. And they were smart because they took what was primarily viewed as a military responsibility and they made it a responsibility of the entire mission. So they included different things like political actions that could and should be taken both at the national level but also at the subnational level to protect civilians. They did talk about protections of civilians from physical violence and then building a safe and protective environment. And in many ways this UN guidance was far ahead of any other guidance that was out there on protection of civilians. Very few countries at that time, in fact no countries really, had doctrine, military, domestic doctrine on protection of civilians, nor did they have training. And yet we were expecting military and civilians, etc., to go into a peacekeeping operation and know how to protect civilians. You cannot train peacekeepers through a 2-week or a 3-month pre-deployment training to protect civilians if it isn't ingrained in their domestic doctrine and training, right? So we now have this guidance from the UN. Dwight and others started to develop doctrine for the US military. Some other states also started to try and develop doctrine and guidance. And then finally last year, NATO developed a concept on the protection of civilians for NATO members and alliance. And so that's the kind of progress I'm talking about. We've now got the guidance and we've got some training. But when I go into the field and I speak to peacekeepers, there's still blank faces, still tremendous confusion. When I was in the US State Department, I would speak to people within the US government, and there was still confusion. What does protection of civilians from other actors meant? Some people believe or think that when we talk about protection of civilians, it only means complying with IHL and the laws of war. Others confuse it with civil-military relations that happen in J9. Others confuse it with humanitarian action that they may do, like in the Haiti earthquake response, for example. Or they conflate it with the responsibility to protect type of actions, including and often sort of what happened in Libya a few years ago. There's very little thought to what kind of tasks you would need to perform, how you would need to approach the protection of civilians once you're already deployed on the ground at the operational and tactical level. And that's where I really feel that this reference guide comes in. I think there's been a number of ways in which this reference guide has updated what was created in 2013 and fills so many of these gaps. I have been asked so many times by military actors in peacekeeping operations, where is my task list? I don't know how to perform protection of civilians if I don't have a task list. But what they often are asking for in that task list is, I want a list of patrols that I should take, or just tell me what to do, without starting from the point of understanding what the threat is. And this reference guide starts at that point. Understanding who the perpetrator is, why they're perpetrating the violence, how they're perpetrating the violence, what their capabilities and resources are. Understanding who's vulnerable, why and how. Understanding who the other protection actors are in the area, what they are doing to help or hurt. And then of course there's a whole plethora of other actors. That is extremely useful because often the tasks that you may perform as a military aren't necessarily different from those that you would perform in another type of military operation, but they must be understood and applied differently. Although I'm going to defer to my military colleagues to correct me if I'm wrong. That is what I've heard. So I do want to say that I think that this is really what has been missing, because without this kind of detailed guidance, we cannot develop the training and we cannot operationalize protection of civilians on the ground. The UN just released new comprehensive training guidance for peacekeeping operations, and it remains at what is not, at the level that is not useful. It's PowerPoint presentations, modules of what the concept means, not how to implement and operationalize it. This provides that. And I especially want to point people to the annexes in the back, because if you're completely, for example, a trainer that's unfamiliar, not only can you understand what POC is, but it gives different options for how to train if you have a few hours, a few days, etc. And while it does have a few hours training option, we all know that that isn't actually very effective in sort of a classroom mode, but rather it has suggestions on tabletop exercises, which Victoria and others have been advocating for some time. So with that, I've probably spoken over my time, but I do just want to mention that next year, October 2019, will be the 20th anniversary of the protection of civilians through peacekeeping. And I think this reference guide and the development of all of the other guidance and the recognition of the importance of protection of civilians makes this a really important time for us collectively in this room to push member states of the UN, of NATO, of the AU, to take action to try and improve their guidance, improve their training, so that we are not constantly hearing about peacekeepers failing to protect civilians a few hundred kilometers from their base. And so that when the US and others are deployed into places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and they may not be there necessarily to protect civilians, but they're going to be faced with that responsibility. 12 of the 14 operations that the AU has ever authorized and deployed have protection of civilians in some component of their mandate or their concept of operations or rules of engagement. Almost every UN peacekeeping operation that is currently authorized or deployed is in part to protect civilians from egregious violence. So as my mentor has said many times, this is a challenge that we can't turn our head away from, and that we must look at seriously, and I believe that this is a great contribution to that. Thanks.
Thanks, Allison. And I would not be bold enough to try to give the hook on any of the speakers here if they think they've exceeded their time, especially not to our next one, General Kem, who's our Commandant at Carlisle Barracks, and sir, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me in the back okay? Well, that was a great presentation, Allison. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody for coming here today. It's great to be here. I'm really here to represent the Army War College, the Peacekeeping Institute, and really the whole United States Army, and I would say in the wider military community in support of this effort. Our team is very proud to be in part and be kind of the final packagers of this Protection of Civilian Military Reference Guide. And I'd like to take a few minutes to just talk about why that's important and some of the complexities that's associated with it from the military side. For many of you, if you've ever been to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, it's about 2 hours north of here, just north of the Gettysburg Battlefield. And every year we take all the Army War College students, about 380 resident students, and then we have a non-resident program that also goes, and we go to Gettysburg. And during the battle, as far as the historians have tracked it, there's only one civilian member died, and that was Jenny Wade. She was killed by a stray bullet while in her sister's kitchen. You think about the clash of two armies that happened at Gettysburg, and there's only one civilian killed. During the Civil War, Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia, we all hear about that horrible march to the sea, and it destroyed a lot of property. But actually, they did a fantastic job of trying to protect civilians at that time from being casualties. Modern conflicts, we know, have been very different. From World War I on, in many ways very different. Part of it's the size of them, part of it's increasing urbanization, and the fact that you could be in a bunch of farmers' fields outside of Gettysburg and you were in the farmers' fields. Now those things happen up and down highways and around cities, and that clash of people is just different. And we also see today many groups who actually target civilians as part of their plan. Right? That's a pretty foreign concept when you go back to the history of the military for about hundreds of years. But now people actually do that by design intent. So I don't have to tell you, all of you, that protection of civilians is important, but let me talk about a few reasons why on the military side it's so important. First, morally, in the old adage, why is there military? It's usually to help protect the nation and to help fight for those people who can't fight themselves, right? The military is doing it on behalf of the people of the nation. And there's legal obligations, which you addressed a little bit of. There's law of war, there's United Nations resolutions, there's laws of the United States that we operate under. All those things kind of come together and talk about trying to protect people, mitigate from having civilian casualties as small as possible. And the more important part is, military actions are directed by our civilian leaders, right? There's a political component to it. There's a reason you're doing this. And that reason is usually because you're trying to build partnership and collaborate to make better things happen. You don't solve it. It doesn't get better when civilians are being killed indiscriminately and randomly, or particularly when they're being targeted. And fourth, and we saw this, we've all seen this in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've seen this throughout the world, we saw this going back World War I, World War II, and that's when you're doing stability and when you're fighting counterinsurgencies, the will of the people is so important. How can you build governance and security and help families and help people in that nation have a better life if the support of civilians is not being done by you, by your partners, but also as you're trying to build the capacity of those other security forces to protect their civilians better, right? It's inherently part of what success would look like. I'll remind you of a vignette from back in the Iraq War where you had an American patrol that was been surrounded by hundreds of Iraqis, citizens that were complaining and fighting. Could have turned into a bloodbath. You have armed soldiers, nervous, you have this big crowd coming at you, and one of the commanders told his troops to take a knee and point their weapons at the ground, right, and defuse the situation. Right? It could have turned into a headline with literally many dozens killed. Instead, it turned into an example of a leader who had thought about it, had been trained, and was trying to figure out through some of the techniques and other things, how do you defuse a situation when it doesn't have to go to a high-end conflict. That doesn't mean that always happens, but if you want to be trained and ready and getting leaders prepared to do that. Dr. Sewell originally coined the term mass atrocity response operations, MARO, which is now part of U.S. military doctrine. Right? All those evolutions have happened in recent years. Military forces may be called to go to prevent genocide and to respond to mass atrocities. Really, in many ways, the most extreme civilian risks and very complex situations to work through. But now that is, we literally spent the time, many people at this table have been part of that, about making that a plan and organized so that when we're presenting information to senior leaders, to civilian military leaders, they have that, I'll call it the playbook, they have that as a sense of responsibility, and people have thought in advance about how to do it. Because what you don't want to do is, at the last minute, go solve this problem, or go react to this crisis. That's not the time to plan. I wonder what the right way to do this is. I wonder what the lessons learned are, because inevitably you'll lose too much. So what's the military doctrine on protection of civilians? We actually, there's a joint publication, 3.0, that says protection of civilians may be the primary purpose of the mission or a supporting task. The protection of civilians from a deliberate attack could be a strategic or operational imperative, which is distinct from U.S. forces, our legal obligations to protect civilians in any kind of conflict, right? It may be a very specified task to go out and do that, kind of what you were just talking about. That wasn't necessarily organized and planned in doctrine 20 or 30 years ago. But now that's recognized as something we may be ready to do. And so if you're going to do that, how do you prepare and train for that? In the U.S., there's never enough training time, but at least we do focus resources and try to prepare for those things. But the wider community, we don't operate in a vacuum just by ourselves. I don't know the actual number, but at any given time, there was more than 40 countries in Afghanistan working with the coalition to support what the coalition was trying to do. So if you're going to be, and they're all operating under the same command in many ways, well then you'd want everybody in that whole team to have a general good understanding and a common framework for how to prepare and protect civilians. So this is the kind of thing that helps to do that. So it's important. And I honor what you were talking about the UN and the increasing role of trying to get more people practice at this so it's not just a headline. The U.S. military has a bunch of other official doctrine, a handful of them that didn't used to exist, and I'll summarize a few. The first Army manual, we call it ATP 3.07-6 for the bureaucrats in the room. Protection of civilians was only published a little over 2 years ago, October of 2015. And there's a joint publication called Peace Operations, which is just about to be published, which has an appendix on the protection of civilians. And there's a multi-service manual that's being worked on. And you start to see increasing references to civilian protection in many other doctrinal manuals. Now recognize doctrine is we put those together to help build a framework. Doctrine is not law, right? Doctrine is guidance and how we operate a general framework. And so education and training and practice becomes important. Otherwise, doctrine is just something written on a piece of paper. And so that's why that's so important. So the reference guide being launched today, it isn't doctrine. It's really designed to be a detailed resource that we can use inside the United States for our military, but also much wider as it gets distributed. Other people, UN and the groups here kind of participate in trying to expand the use of this. The real change is it really kind of builds upon what we've learned as we've tried to produce doctrine in recent years. And as we try to work on taking those lessons learned over the last 25 plus years, and on this round incorporate and doing some of the things Allison talked about. There's really three fundamentals I'd highlight, understanding civilian risks, protect civilians during operations, and then shape the protective environment. And there's a whole bunch of tasks in there, 45 tasks. If you look at page 10 in there, it has a very nice laydown trying to explain how it all kind of come together into a coherent picture. But it's hard business, right? Military operations are very complex. And this reference guide is really to help simplify that and protect the civilians for commanders and staffs and soldiers. When I say simplify, I don't mean it will be simple. You can't make it simple, but this gives a way to help get your head around it. So it's not discovery learning just by you. You now have the benefit of the experience of the folks here, the Peacekeeping Institute from the Army, many NGOs, the other nations we've been involved in to help try to really put together something effective. Chapter 5 discusses the trade-offs and challenges and risks, which we also can't forget. Often, the reality is, in a high-end conflict, civilians will be killed. Right? That's the nature of war. It's unfortunate, it will happen, but manuals like this help try to get commanders and staffs to think about what can we do to try to protect them as best we can. Okay? The measure of success is a very complicated situation. Sometimes we hear about the trade-off, right, between protection of the force, protection of civilians, and accomplishing the mission. Trade-off is kind of a wrong term, right? Trade-off implies you have to give up one to get the other. And what this tries to lay out is, and military operation manuals talk about is, look, you're trying to accomplish all those things simultaneously, right? And it's not a seesaw where you're going to, today I'm going to choose to not protect civilians, I'm going to go for the mission. But tomorrow I'm going to do the opposite. Now all those things come together as you're planning, but as the military, you have to be planning the protection of civilians as an inherent part of it. Okay? And I think this helps to do that. As you know, results will most seldom be perfect. I'll give you a couple of historical examples just because they're kind of interesting. The Normandy campaign resulted in the death of an estimated 15 to 20,000 French civilians. And that wasn't just D-Day, that was those first 2 months or so up in the Normandy campaign. Mostly from Allied bombing. Okay, now granted today we have a little more accurate bombing, we don't have to, but realize that's an amazing number when you think about it. However, the bombing largely prevented the Germans' Operation Reserve from maneuvering, helped lead to the end of World War II, the end of the Holocaust. There was a Dutch historian who lived nearby who said he and his family prayed every night to be saved from both the Germans, who were supposedly defending them, according to the Germans, from the Allied bombers that were supposedly freeing them. And their prayer every day would be, Lord, liberate us from our protectors and protect us from our liberators. Right? It's a complex business, and you'd be hard-pressed to say that it's just very difficult. And it's more than just avoiding civilian casualties during combat operations. For example, during the Chinese intervention, when they attacked in the Korean War, the 10th U.S. Corps did a seaborne withdrawal to try to get unstuck from where the Chinese had attacked, from the Hunan. They actually brought out 100,000 Korean civilians when they did their withdrawal by sea. Right? That wasn't required by the mission. Okay? They didn't get directed from the United States to bring in 100,000 Koreans. They said, we ought to be doing the best we can to try to do this. And so they worked to make it happen. Certainly made it more complex. Okay? But those are those decisions you're doing between mission, protection of civilians, protecting yourself, where leaders have to think through it and err and do the right thing. I recently reread T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War. It's a story of unpreparedness. The U.S. wasn't really ready for the Korean War. And it talks about the loss of readiness and equipment and training and leadership. And there's a few examples in there of American soldiers. They were very ill prepared, firing on Korean refugees. Right? They had just completely chaos situation and pretty big loss of life if you go back and study it. That's what books like this help prevent. Right? It's only a book. Now it takes training and education, but it's a big part of trying to work through that so nobody goes unprepared. Okay, so leaders have already thought through it, so that our U.S. soldiers, airmen, Marines, are all ready, sailors are ready and prepared to think through the complexity of what they have to do. And you would like to think all those things happen, right? You accomplish the mission, you protect your own forces, and you protect civilians, and we have success. I guess the last thing I'd like to say is just thanks for your attention today. We at the Army War College, and particularly the Peacekeeping Institute, who were such an integral part of this, really know that this is important work, and we're glad to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And before we turn to our last speaker, I'll just mention that after we finish the prepared comments from the panel, we're going to open it up to questions and answers and also discussion, because there's a lot of distinguished people in the protection of civilians field in the audience, and I'm sure you have some things to add as well. Now for our final speaker, General Kem mentioned that Dr. Sewell was the founder of the Mass Atrocity Response Operations MARO project, and which culminated in the MARO Handbook, which PKSOI collaborated with her for that several years ago. And I'd say, in addition to Allison, she is, Dr. Sewell is another one of the main inspirations for the POC guide. A lot of what was reflected in the MARO Handbook in terms of frameworks and the different actors and the conceptual approaches for employing forces were from the MARO Handbook and have been carried over. Dr. Sewell's a true visionary, and she's always looking kind of 2 horizons over the next horizon in terms of what's coming up as a critical issue, whether it's civilian casualty mitigation, whether it was the protection of civilians in the context of counterinsurgency operations. And I'm very eager to find out what the next project I'm going to be working on is. Dr. Sewell.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here. Thank you to the Holocaust Memorial Museum for hosting this event, and congratulations to Dwight and to everyone who worked on this publication for seeing it through. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think in many ways this Protection of Civilians Military Reference Guide encapsulates the way the world has come to think more broadly and more concretely about the challenge of civilian protection. I think this is a wonderful starting point for precisely the military individual who is facing a mission that they weren't necessarily expecting and that hadn't been their last 3 training cycles, to get their head around the kinds of questions to ask and how to prepare themselves or their teams for the unexpected. This is a really wonderful contextual guide to a broad range of issues. And it does reflect what the political leadership of many states in the international community have come to demand of military forces. So I commend the War College for its leadership on this, and I think it really is a hugely important, essentially vocabulary and syntax for linking together those who are less familiar and those who are international in a common way of trying to unpack the problem of civilian protection. What I've been asked to do is think about what the challenges for next steps or for realizing the potential of a document like this are. And so I want to underscore how enthusiastic I am about this project and in general about the thought leadership of PKSOI in filling gaps that are left unfulfilled by the institutional Army writ large, by Big Army, by the other services in their absence of an equivalent capacity to PKSOI. But I want to try to unpack what I think are the broader challenges that we face in making the best use of a product such as this. And the first really has to do with the understanding on the part of political leaders and civilians themselves, citizens themselves, as to what the words protection of civilian means. This is a pretty thick book. Not everybody is going to read it. Not everybody's going to understand what the military jargon in this book means. But what we do know is that the UN, as Allison reminds us, has increasingly demanded that UN peacekeeping forces take on civilian protection tasks. At the same time, the international system has also said that sovereignty is conditional, and if states are unwilling or unable to protect their civilians, the international community should step in. And so there may be the need for a military intervention to protect civilians that is strategic in its nature, as opposed to a UN operation that has tactical requirements, tasks of civilian protection to be carried out in addition to other tasks. And then more broadly, there is not the act of commission of civilian protection, either at the strategic level where it is the entire purpose of the mission, or at the tactical level where they are tasks to be performed in the context of a mission that may have multiple dimensions. But there's the act of omission, which, as Major John Kem said, has to do with not killing civilians when we are using force. And that is the absence of civilian casualties while using military force, whether for the protection of civilians or for other purposes. So this language that we use, protection of civilians, can mean a variety of different things. And in the way that our civilian leadership talks about protection of civilians, in the way that UN mandates talk about protection of civilians, there's always a risk that it means different things to different people. And I think we saw that to some extent in the debate that surrounded the Libya intervention in terms of what it meant to protect civilians. And the reality is that protecting civilians does not mean simply not using force, nor does it mean using force with the guarantee that you're only going to take defensive action and civilians will be protected. It may in fact mean offensive operations in order to defeat perpetrators that are the source of harm for civilians. But those are subtleties and complexities that are not necessarily recognized either at the level of political debate about a military intervention or the application of military tools, and nor are they easily translated into a military vernacular that isn't centrally revolving around civilians or the absence of civilian harm. So this book is really an important step, but it begs this translation question about how we think and talk about a concept that has very different forms. I mean, even in the earlier presentations, Allison was really emphasizing UN peacekeeping operations. Major John Kem was really concentrating more in his examples on the absence of killing civilians in the context of using force. The R2P debate is an entirely different debate, very much related to both of those other elements, but also distinct. And so we have a lot of work as an intellectual community, the political community has a lot of work in making sure that we're clear and precise in using that term and in accepting what it means. Because, as Major General Kem said, the use of force is inherently risky. The second area that I think awaits us is a more detailed unpacking of some of the elements of civilian protection. The area that I've worked on most closely has to do with, notwithstanding the R2P Mara work, is the absence of civilian harm, the mitigation of civilian harm in the context of using military forces. And the US military has done more than almost any military on the planet to inculcate our troops with the ethos that they must abide by the law of armed conflict and that they shouldn't kill civilians. At the same time, our practice of mitigating civilian casualties remains one in which it is largely learned through personal experience rather than truly institutionalized. And again, this document is a very important first step in laying out the problem set and in putting the law of armed conflict in context. And yet, I know from studies that I've done in Afghanistan that we have yet to fully capture the depth of learning that we have done as a military on how to mitigate civilian harm. And that we could do much more to capture those lessons and best practices so that individuals don't have to learn through their own mistakes. And And the contexts in which force is used will matter enormously. But it is curious if you have studied in detail, for example, General McChrystal's tactical directives in Afghanistan in 2009-10 and looked at the level of understanding about the context of Afghanistan and the risks that existed if you didn't have a full pattern of life assessment, if you were trying to strike a structure that you couldn't see underneath, if you were operating in an urban environment, and if you weren't facing an exigent threat that would prevent you from accomplishing your mission. And when you take the overlay of those lessons and then you look more recently, for example, at the offensive in Mosul, and you look at the example of taking out 2 snipers with a GBU-38 or whatever it was that we used without a pattern of life assessment, and you ask yourself what the exigent circumstances of that were, and seek to understand why more than 100 civilians were killed, it does make you ask whether we have done the best job that we can capturing lessons from our own experience and institutionalizing them. So again, there's a broad framework here that's essential in this guide that reinforces the commitment of the U.S. Armed Forces to minimize civilian harm. And yet there's much more that can be done to capture hard-earned lessons and make sure that they're available to those we ask to take risks and put themselves in harm's way. This relates to the third general challenge, which is the implementation. As Major General Kem said, the doctrine itself sits on a shelf. We have lots of doctrine nobody consults. And I think, one of the opportunities that we have going forward is to really sort of keep a real-time assessment of who's using these materials. How much are they integrated into our national training centers? At what level are U.S. forces exposed to these concepts? How do they make it into metal? How do we reward people for their cognizance of these concepts and their implementation of them? And so it's not just a question of education, it's a question of training, because the training is where you build the muscle memory, and it's where you build the combat mentality or the application mentality. And so we ought to do a good job going forward trying to understand how a document such as this is really inculcated more deeply into the institutional sinews of each of the different services. And that applies similarly in other contexts. Alice had mentioned the enormous progress that's been made in terms of particularly in UN standards, NATO's growing interest in thinking about these issues more broadly than simply UN peacekeeping, and the exciting possibilities that exist of building a global community that is more deeply seeking to both create a common framework and a common set of tasks and standards for what these words mean at the political level. But we'll want to understand when that's really happening, and when it's not just those of us who are at the conference tables saying that we have these documents and being rightly proud of what we've produced. We're going to want to know, what does it really mean to those that have to execute? And so keeping track of that is work that we have to do going forward, and encouraging that is work that we have to do going forward. And so, the museum itself, organizations such as the Stimson Center and the people there like Tori Holt, who have done incredible work, and Allison, who have done incredible work on these issues, but others who don't necessarily think about themselves as getting into the nuts and bolts of military doctrine or training. That's the work that we have ahead of us in terms of trying to support and squeeze the most out of what is a very important contribution that PKSOI is sharing with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dwight. My name is Keeler. I'm with the Center for the Prevention of Genocide here at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I just wanted to thank the panelists, thank Allison Giffen, Major General John Kem, Dwight Raymond, and Dr. Sarah Sewell for today's incredibly timely and important conversation. And I'd also like to thank the Army War College for partnering with us. Before, when we were coming up here, I said to Dwight that I've been a kind of stalker of his work in the best possible way for over the last decade, and it is incredibly humbling to be able to be here and to have the opportunity to shed light on this important guide, because there are people here, Victoria Holt, Dr. Sarah Sewell. The Marrow book was on the table on my old office for years, and I think I copied almost verbatim into some statements at the UN language from it, Dwight's work, Allison's work. So you guys have really done remarkable efforts to try to help define a field and inform not just how the military understands the protection of civilians, but I wouldn't underscore the importance that your work has had in helping those of us working in the human rights and humanitarian space understand what POC should be for the military, but also help us begin to understand the challenges that you all face in actually operationalizing this. And the reason that we think it's so critical here at the Center of the Prevention of Genocide, and why we wanted to try to help work with our partners to host today's conversation, is that we really see that these issues are very much at the fore of where the atrocity prevention agenda needs to go. To echo what Dr. Sewell said, we do feel as though there were a number of missed opportunities in the last administration, and though it remains unclear right now how far and where we can go, we would like to explore that and see if, as an institution, we can help work with many of the partners in this room to advance efforts around the protection of civilians. Our interest is multifold. I think at the outset of Dwight's guide, he talks about kind of the protection of civilians from military forces in two contexts, both the avoidance of civilian harm and deliberate protection of civilians' actions. That's so critical to all of our work. The work that we've been doing on South Sudan that highlights the challenges around these so-called de facto protection sites, and the fact that peacekeepers simply cannot actually meet the needs of vulnerable communities there and are asked to be doing things through their mandates that they're not trained as of yet to be able to do. But also in terms of deliberate protection of civilians' actions, it's very humbling for those of us here at the center who've been working on Iraq to speak with Yazidis and to go to areas around Mount Sinjar, and to echo Joel's point, the just sheer devastation of the infrastructure and of these communities, but then to talk to men who were in communities where there were massacres that took place. And I had one man tell me about how he was shot and lay in a kind of unfortunate pile of bodies, but he heard planes overhead. And because there had just been the strikes on Mount Sinjar, he thought that it was the Americans coming to rescue him. He thought that you were able to see on the ground. And I think it raises a lot of really challenging questions about what can communities expect? How can we articulate what those expectations are? How can we help to ensure that we are taking to the core of the work that all of us do, the importance of the protection of civilians. So part of what we'd like to do now, and I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this part of the conversation, we would like to try to use this as a catalyst to help define the starts of a conversation around kind of an agenda forward, both for my Center for the Prevention of Genocide and also for Jen and her colleagues who do a lot of work on the training